So welcome everyone to this webinar on PowerPoint presentations to support health literacy and accessibility. I am Hayat Ahmed. I'm a program manager at the Multi-Regional Clinical Trials Center of Brigham and Women's Hospital in Harvard, or the MRCT Center for short. I want to give a warm welcome to our panelists, Williane de Cormier-Plosky, who is a program director at the MRCT Center, Michelle Watkins, who is the HRPP IRB Training Communications Manager at Rutgers University, and Stephanie Gonzalez, who is a lead writer at SMC Consulting. I would like to invite them to introduce themselves and say why they're interested in this work. And I will start with you, Williane.
Great. Thanks so much, Hayat. And it's such a pleasure to be here. I'm Williane de Cormier-Plosky, as she said, a program director at the MRCT Center. I got involved in work on disability rights in high school. But I had the privilege of working with Judy Heumann at the World Bank and others over the last 20 years. And since that time, we've been working on a project on inclusion of people with disabilities in clinical research at the MRCT Center for the last 3 years. And over to Michelle.
Thank you so much. I'm Michelle Watkinson. I'm the Human Research Protection Program and IRB Training Communications Manager. I oversee education and outreach and also onboarding for IRB members. I am a person with a disability, and I've been very involved in advocacy over the last 20 plus years, but I stepped away and now I've come back, and I'm really excited to be here and to really add more to the conversation and to the direction for not only research, but for our organizations as well. So turn back.
Thank you. And Stephanie?
Hi, I am Dr. Stephanie Gonzalez, and I am lead writer for health and wellness for SMC Consulting. And I first became interested in accessibility during my previous role at Health Literacy Media, where they really strive. It's beyond plain language. They really strive to make accessibility a reality for all kinds of, for multimedia, for videos, for slide decks. And that's where I really got my feet wet in this particular field. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. Closed captioning is enabled, so if you'd like to view captions, please click on the CC or live transcript box and select Show Captions. Please make sure to keep them in English. Unfortunately, if you change the language, it will change it for everybody, and we quite haven't figured out how to work around it. And another note, please put comments in the chat box and submit questions if you have for the panelists in the Q&A box. We will have a discussion at the end, so please put your questions in the Q&A box and comments in the chat. Thank you. And next slide. Next slide. Thank you. So this is our standard disclaimer, and the materials and opinions expressed here are our own and not intended to represent the institutions. The MRCT Center is supported by voluntary contributions, but our work is autonomous, and we are very transparent about it, and we have a Creative Commons license. Next slide. A little bit about the MRCT Center. We are a research and policy center based in Boston, Massachusetts, and we are focused on addressing the conduct, oversight, ethics, and regulatory environment for clinical trials around the world. We engage various stakeholders to do this work within the clinical research landscape. Next slide. October is Health Literacy Month, and this is the third webinar in the series. The prior webinars on designing impactful informed consent processes and creating plain language summaries are available on our website. And I want to give a quick shout out to Sylvia Bader-Cases, who leads our health literacy portfolio. Thank you. And next slide. This webinar is also being hosted by the REACH project, and REACH stands for the Research Ethics Action Collaborative for HRPPs. It is a collaboration between the MRCT Center, Mass General Brigham, AAHRPP, which is the Association for the Accreditation of Human Research Protections Program, and PRIM&R, which is the Public Responsibility in Medicine and Research. It's a collaborative that is there to collate resources around DEI and representation that are specifically geared or tailored for HRPPs and IRBs. Next slide. So we've had 2 webinars this year as part of this series, and they are also available on our website. Next slide. And before we get started again, I want to give a quick plug for our annual symposium. The MRCT Center is celebrating its 15th year, and we want to invite you to join us for a public session which will be taking place on Thursday, November 14th. In Boston. The registration link, I believe, will be available in the chat, and it's also available on our website. So help us celebrate 15 years of MRCT Center. Next slide. Our agenda for today includes hearing about accessible PowerPoints from an IRB perspective, as well as from a designer's perspective. And Liliane will go through the 10 steps on how to do PowerPoints that are accessible, and there will be an interactive exercise towards the end. Next slide. So just a little bit of background on health literacy. Health literacy is essentially our ability to obtain, process, and understand health information to make informed decisions. And we will focus on 3 key concepts today. The first one is plain language, which is needed to communicate in a way that is clear and understood by everyone. Next is inclusive language and cultural considerations, which are essential for respectful and sensitive communication across diverse populations. And third is clear and accessible design, which ensures that information is presented in formats that everyone can access, including people with disabilities. Additionally, other elements include usability testing, numeracy, and interactive techniques, and are explored further in our health literacy work. Next slide. So as we know, nearly 60% of meetings are now virtual, and PowerPoint presentations are a staple in these settings. However, if attendees struggle to access these materials, they risk missing out on crucial information that affects their involvement in clinical research. So it's really important to make PowerPoints accessible more than ever. And with that, I'll hand it over to Michelle.
Thank you so much, Hyatt. So next slide. So just so you know, I will be taking myself off of camera just to prevent any kind of technical issues, but you'll obviously hear me. So I'm going to be sharing the IRB perspective, the Institutional Review Board perspective on why accessibility is so important. Well, we play a vital role. And so the voices and experiences of people with disabilities must be actively included, not only in clinical research, but social behavioral research. This helps lead to more accurate understanding of the needs, challenges, and perspectives that are vital for designing effective solutions and policies that truly address our needs, rather than perpetuating exclusionary practices. There are some major reasons why inclusive and accessible research matters for people with disabilities or disabled people, and I use those terms interchangeably. Accurate representation. By involving people with disabilities in research, researchers gain valuable insights into the lived experiences and perspectives, which can often be overlooked when relying solely on non-disabled participants or researchers' assumptions or outdated information. Then there's identifying barriers and challenges. People with disabilities face persistent discrimination and are purposely excluded from clinical trials research that thus limits access to life-changing or life-saving healthcare resources. In August of this year, the National Council of Disability released a report entitled "The Implicit and Explicit Exclusion of People with disabilities in clinical trials. This report showcases different kinds of exclusionary practices that prevent people with disabilities from participating in clinical trials. And importantly, it also discusses how healthcare practitioners' internal biases and federal policies contribute to the participation rate disparity, and how this disparity impacts people with disabilities and the efficacy of clinical trials. Inclusive research can pinpoint specific obstacles and challenges faced by people with disabilities in various aspects of life, including healthcare, education, employment, accessibility, allowing for more targeted interventions. It also allows for the co-creation of solutions when people with disabilities are involved in the research process. So that includes also design. We can actively contribute to this design of solutions and interventions that are most relevant and effective for the community needs. Plus, it allows us to combat ableism. By actively including people with disabilities in research and the design, researchers can challenge ableistic assumptions and stereotypes, promoting a more inclusive society. There are two phenomenal books. Tiffany Yu's The Anti-Ableist Manifesto and Emily Landau's Demystifying Disability that delve into the awareness and anti-ableism advocacy to begin the conversations. Next slide, please. There's also empowerment and agency. So the participation empower people with disabilities by giving them a platform to share their experience and influence research agendas. And there's ethical responsibility, including the oversight review. So in 2019, there was a published study from Dr. Meg McMillan out of Troy University addressing accessibility issues in institutional review board policies. They looked at the original land-grant universities. Just in case you're not aware, a land-grant university is a college or university in the United States that received federal or state funds through the Morrill Act of 1862. And it was established to provide education to the working class and set aside federal lands to establish public institutions. Fun fact, in 1864, Rutgers became New Jersey's land-grant institution after winning a competition against Princeton. Rutgers remains the largest healthcare and higher ed institution in the state of New Jersey and our only land-grant institution. These researchers obtained IRB policies from land-grant university websites. So there was about 55 institutions in their sample. And what did the research aim to do? Next slide. They conducted a keyword search to locate references to disability-related information on the IRB websites. They looked at disability accommodation, Section 508 or Section 504, Americans with Disabilities Act, accessibility, readability, usability, and technology. And what they found was that none of these schools included any key words such as the ones above in the IRB policies that required in the inclusive design for research. For example, including students with disabilities as a potential research population to pull from. Next slide. So what are some steps that not only IRBs, but for those of you in clinical research organizations or policymakers or researchers or within HRPPs, what else can we do? Well, the future is brimming with hope and possibilities to dismantle injustice and ableism. Human research protection programs and IRBs are critical in promoting inclusivity in research through ethical, in-depth review processes and policies that promote ethical research and the approval. We can play a major part in helping not only our staff, but also reviewers in the community become better aware of accessibility and its relationship to clinical and social behavioral research. This can be achieved through a variety of methods, including educational workshops and trainings and up-to-date resource information. For example, templates and forms and policies. They need to change from a deficit approach. Most of the policies that exist for the inclusion of different groups of individuals look at, for example, the lack of capacity to consent, that moving from that deficit approach to an approach that all people with disabilities have agency and the ability to consent unless otherwise indicated. And so looking at the forms that are on our websites, not only to the participants, including more information about them, but also ensuring accessibilities for researchers who may also have sensory or cognitive or physical disabilities. For example, NIH requires that women and members of racial and ethnic minority groups be included in funded research. And as of last year, in September, NIH, the National Institute of Health, also designated people with disabilities as a population with health disparities. Next slide, please. So advocacy. So this is where it's important as key policymakers and researchers and members of the HRPP and IRBs that we can align ourselves with disability advocates and organizations that conduct accessible research and are led by people who have the expertise and can foster the inclusivity in the research designs that specifically engage people with diverse disabilities. And then there's also the development of a community action board that can include community representation and people of all different types of disabilities. Here at Rutgers, we've begun a community action board led by my amazing colleague, Geraldine Pierre, and our AVP, Hila Berger. While we're in our early stages, we developed a dedicated community board of activists to focus on accessible and high quality research by bringing insight and perspectives into the review of the research that ensures the rights and welfare of research participants from all communities. It's a liaison between our researchers, the IRB, and participants, a partnership that can help bridge those gaps. Next slide. Thank you, and I'll turn this back over to Willianne.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for all of those great insights from the IRB perspective. So I'm going to go through some how-tos for PowerPoint, since as Hayat said, pretty much everyone is using PowerPoint now. Everybody needs PowerPoint to present, and we had somebody ask about, can I get the slides in the chat? Everybody uses the slides after meetings, so very important to make these accessible. So I'm going to go through 10 steps. They focus not just on the programming in PowerPoint, but kind of all of the things around PowerPoint that you need to be thinking about. So step 1, define the intended purpose for the PowerPoint. As I mentioned, PowerPoint has many purposes. It can be a memory aid for, if you're presenting. It can be a summary of key points from the presentation. You can use them for on-demand training or a tool to create infographics. A lot of times we first do these in PowerPoint and then we put them in a design software. Or as a slideshow in front of the room. There's all different kinds of purposes, and you just have to think about what your intended purpose is. And we suggest you kind of look at other examples so you can kind of get a sense of, fit for purpose. Next slide, please. So, sorry, one back. So step 2 aligns with purpose is to define the intended audience for the PowerPoint. So almost kind of like you're designing a clinical trial, purpose, audience, So think about what is the expected audience size, because some meeting formats allow for different audience sizes, and then you have to prepare your PowerPoint presentation accordingly. You have to understand, will the audience include people with disabilities? We put a hint here. Yes, always. Most people, for example, I am also a person with a disability. I do not have a visible disability, but many people that you might not even know have disabilities, and you need to kind of consider that at the outset. Did you ask about accommodations in your registration and other forms? Will the audience include non-English speakers? So for example, the text on the PowerPoint, and I've gotten caught by this before, you make text boxes and you think about them in English, but if you don't leave enough space around your text box when you translate into Spanish or another language, sometimes the text is longer and it overruns the box, and it gets very confusing for people who are using this in other languages. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so step 3, design for mental processing. So this is kind of trying to make it easier for you to understand the flow of the PowerPoint. So for example, provide an agenda or background information early in the presentation. Check the reading order for the text or the graphics on the slide. So in English, we read from left to right and we go from up to down. So you kind of want your information to flow that way, or your graphics to flow that way, clockwise, I guess I should say as well. But in other languages, that might not be the case. So you just have to kind of consider that. Also trying to give breaks from being talked at. We'll do an exercise later in the presentation. Pause for questions and try and build in places where you can reinforce concepts with examples. And then try and summarize key takeaways. Next slide, please. So here we're moving into plain language. Step 4A is plain language, appropriate language. Plain language is step A. So we've talked a little bit about this in the other health literacy webinars, but plain language is a clear and understandable way of communicating. So some helpful hints about that, at least that I found in my experience, is first to break up large blocks of text. So if you have a very dense paragraph, you probably want to break it into multiple sections, either with bullet points or separate sentences. You try and identify complex words and substitute simpler ones. And if you're using a complex word the first time in a sentence, try and define it. It can also help to hyperlink to a definition. And Sylvia and the health literacy team have developed a wonderful clinical research glossary that you can go to for many of these definitions. You may also use a health literacy checker app. So you put your text into the app and it'll come back and tell you what grade level it's in. And it also highlights problematic words. We suggest you edit the text to be at about a 6th grade reading level for the general population. But if you're working with people with cognitive and intellectual disabilities, you might want to reduce that a little bit. You need to ask your audience. Next slide, please. So more inappropriate language is inclusive language. For people with disabilities, you want to try and avoid colloquialisms like, let's lift our voices, or put your best foot forward, or let's stand with us, especially if you're doing something in advocacy. I catch myself doing this, sometimes. You also want to ask if the audience would like to use person-first language, such as person with autism, or identity-first language, like autistic person. And just as Michelle did, she clarified which she's using in her presentation. So you can use one or the other or both, which is what we end up doing in this presentation. And recognize that people have intersecting identities. For example, on the screen, you can see a list of our tools for, or a reference to our list of tools in LGBTQIA+ inclusion. And just recognize that people often have, intersecting identities and that you want your language to be inclusive of everyone. Next slide, please. Okay, so getting into designing for readability. Okay, so you want to make sure you have unique and descriptive slide titles, and that the slide title is formatted as a title. And I'll get back into this a little more later. Don't use serif fonts. You want to use sans serif fonts. So you can see on the screen some examples of the serif fonts like Curly and Magneto, and you can see those are a little hard to, kind of see. So aim for a serif font like Calibri or Avenir, and about 20 point size or larger, but it depends on the font because some fonts are larger. When you're using bullet options, make sure you use a period at the end of each one so that screen readers can tell the difference between bullet points. Align to the left, not justified or centered. And try to limit the use of bold font, italics, all caps, all these kinds of things that we normally do for emphasis. Try and just keep your text in a regular format where possible. Next slide, please. Okay, here's a lesson I have learned. When you insert a screenshot, as you see on the left side of your screen, not only can it be blurry and difficult to see, but screen readers cannot read a picture like this. They can't read the text because it's in a picture format. So for example, if you have a graphic that's announcing your annual meeting and you have the graphic picture and the text as part of the picture, They're not going to be able to read the announcement for the dates and times and such. So if you have to include a screenshot, we recommend that you make sure that you include clarifying alt text, which I'll go into in a minute. Next slide, please. So we suggest that you reformat. For example, I have a table here where I took the screenshot and recreated it. When you're creating tables, though, it's important to understand that for screen readers to read these, you need to test it. So for example, if you start in the grouping box at the top, if you tab, it should go to key points. If you hit tab again, it should go to be respectful. So you should be able to tab easily with your keyboard through the table if you use a table. Next slide, please. Design for readability. Line spacing should be appropriate, and we show some examples here. For example, having a line spacing of at least 1.1. And this you'll see later, if you download the slides, it shows you how to go to the paragraph and change the spacing. Next slide, please. So mental processing and sensory processing are somewhat similar, but sensory processing is around things like bright lights, flashing. These are all the kinds of things that actually drive me crazy when I see something and my mind doesn't want to do it. So avoid busy patterns, especially if you're embedding important information within that pattern. It's like trying to find the date that you're looking for within like this, wallpaper. Try to avoid using the CAPTCHA and reCAPTCHA tests, like where you have a grid and it's like, find all of the lampposts and you're like, try not to do those. Avoid using animation. I know we all love animation in PowerPoint, but it can be difficult when there's things zooming across your screen. If you have to use animation, you can use the appear, which is a little bit easier on the eyes than something that's spinning or zooming. Again, with things like autoplay audio or video, you want to disable those and make sure all elements are clearly visible on the screen. You can tell even in this one, we're having trouble finding the advance to the next slide because it's clear. You have to find it. And don't use countdowns or timers. Those are very stressful. You've got 20 seconds to answer this question. Next slide, please. Okay, so a couple more things. And I should note that we actually have developed a series of 6 Accessibility 101 trainings that we'll be posting the website for this in a minute that go into more detail on things like alt text, plain language, accessible PowerPoints, and color contrast. So I'm just giving you an overview here because otherwise this would take more than an hour. So for alt text are written statements that describe an image or graphic for a person who's not able to see it. And basically a screen reader, which is a software that someone with a visual disability uses, can read what you put for the alt text. You can use alt text for any kind of image, such as an icon, a picture, an illustration, sometimes for a logo, or for a chart, depending on how complex the chart is. The alt text can also be displayed by websites if the images do not load properly, and I've often found this helpful if the website's not loading, you can see the alt text and you still know a little bit about what's being displayed. So next slide, please. So just a little bit about alt text. I just want to give you some key takeaways. So the main thing about alt text is it should convey the meaning of the image. You don't want to just say, this is a picture of a scale. Well, yeah, it is, but why are you using a picture of a scale to complement your text? So here, for example, if we're talking about, I think this was from a slideshow we did on DE&I, we would say it's an icon of a scale representing justice to show that it's equally balanced. So we're really getting at the concept of equity. For alt text, when you're writing your alt text, you don't have to do it for everything. If it's a decorative object, like, a circle around something or, something decorative, you can label it as decorative in alt text. There's a little box to check. You don't want to insert personal opinions about what you see on the picture. Like, that's a really disheveled patient, or that mom looks really she's had a rough day. Probably just, you just say it's a woman holding a baby or something like that. You should be able to clearly describe the image succinctly. If you have to write and write and write like paragraphs of information to describe your image, it's probably not a good image to use because no one's going to get what you mean. Next slide, please. Very basic instruction on how to do alt text. On the screen here, you can see just behind this alt text box, there's a picture of someone using a Braille typewriter. I had right-clicked on that, and you can see it highlights in this kind of, circle border. You click View Alt Text from the drop-down menu, and it brings up a box where you can enter in the alt text. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to suggest that you go to our color contrast module, after this training for more information, because color contrast of all of the training modules for Accessibility 101 is the most challenging. It's the most techie of the things that you might need to do. And so I'm just giving you an overview of kind of key points, not exactly how to do alt text. So the main key point is that you want a high level of contrast between your text or your foreground color and the fill or background color. So you can see at the right, the Welcome to the MRCT Center at the top has a dark blue fill or background color and a light foreground color. Alternatively, at the bottom, you have a very light background color, white, and a very dark foreground color for the text, which is black. So that's a very good color contrast. But if you have something somewhere in the middle, it can be very difficult to see, and you need to use a checker to assess if your color contrast is okay. Next slide, please. So just 2 more steps to go. One is there's a really cool feature in most Microsoft Office products called Check Accessibility. And I believe it's right on the banner if you go to Review, and then you go to Check Accessibility, and you do a drop down. You just click Check Accessibility, and it does all kinds of fun things. Like it'll tell you if you're missing alt text on some of your images. It'll tell you if the reading order is kind of out of order. I think it tells you if you're missing slide titles. So there's a lot of good things in there. So I always, after I've done my PowerPoint, I always do the check accessibility to test if there's anything missing. All right, next slide. So thank you folks for getting to slide, whatever number we're on, but step 10. So you created your PowerPoint. You have this lovely PowerPoint. Not quite done though. You can't just wash your hands and walk away because your PowerPoint has to be presented out there in the world. It still needs to be accessible while it's being presented. So a couple of things to keep in mind. As I mentioned before, you need to make sure that your registration forms for the webinar, such as this one, are accessible. They're in an accessible format with, good size font, good color contrast, and that you ask about accommodations in that form. That you make sure you enable closed captioning during the meeting and also in your PowerPoint, which you can do by selecting Always Use Subtitles, which is on the Captions and Subtitles section under Slideshow. You want to record the session so you can access it. People can access it later in the format that they, or the video format they like the best, and post that video and audio recording. It's also very helpful to post a transcript, even though closed captioning is enabled. And I know it does take more time, but please review your transcript before you post it, because what comes out of the default from Zoom or other software doesn't necessarily make sense. So you want to make sure you kind of review it before you post the transcript. It's also helpful to post a bibliography of resources that are mentioned during the PowerPoint, which we will do when we send you a link of this PowerPoint. So those resources are separate and kind of easy to access. And then all of the post webinar communications are also accessible. So again, not just making the PowerPoint and doing it during the webinar, but your follow-up needs to be accessible as well. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie to give you some helpful hints that I might not have described, and just she has such a wealth of experience doing this. So here's some helpful hints from Stephanie.
One, we have thrown a lot of information your way, and it can be or seem overwhelming. You might not know where to start. A lot of people stop with accessibility there. You know, they have good intentions, they want to make it accessible, but it seems overwhelming. There are so many moving parts, so many different categories of information to accessibility that people just give up sometimes. There are ways to tackle this. You can consider, for example, using a pre-made accessible PowerPoint template by typing accessible templates in the search field under the new slide deck tab. And you would be surprised how many of the variety of options that you have now that I expect will only grow over time. Next slide, please. Use Microsoft and other support tools. So let's say you modify these accessible templates. You found an accessible template, you're starting a new slide deck, and you modify one of the slides. Let's say you move text boxes around or images around. You're going to want to pay special attention to that slide because you may have modified some of the accessibility features there. If you want to check this, or if you just want to check for particular kinds of accessibility in an already made slide deck, make use of Microsoft and other support tools. They have a very good set of online support tools. For example, I started with accessible. Well, first I was overwhelmed. And then I said, okay, let me start at the beginning. My slide decks have a lot of text, white space, and images. That's what I have. I have text in that order. So I said, let me start at the beginning. Let's start with the text and the reading order. So I dove into checking the reading order. So let's say you want to do that. To check the reading order on each slide, you want to click on review, check accessibility. We talked about checking accessibility. And on the drop-down menu, you'll see reading order pane, and it will come up on the right-hand side of your screen, the reading order by number. Or you can use this helpful video for reference. Next slide, please. Ooh. Did we miss a slide? Oh, maybe not. Okay, no, that's okay. Tips from experience. Now, rules do vary by language. So if you are translating directly from English into another language and you have created an accessible slide deck, you've checked the reading order, you've done your alt text, you've done all the good stuff, and you translate that into Spanish, that could create issues. You might look at the accessibility checker and all of a sudden it says that you have 3 or 4 errors in any number of slides. That's because, you know, each language is its own universe. So if you are translating, just be aware that it can affect accessibility. You're going to want to go through that again to make sure that it is accessible in the translated language. So for example, in Spanish, we talked about how the text runs long. In Arabic, you read from right to left, so that it can affect reading order, especially when you are placing, you know, when you are rearranging certain different features on your slide. And even the screen reader pronunciation for participants, like in the introductory slides, when you're saying, hey, everybody, this is how we participate and this is what we do. Maybe that can also be accounted for, you know, because in audio settings for text and multimedia, so that people can have an intelligible version of the language. I once had to hear Spanish spoken with an English accent, and I promise you it was painful. And definitely not intelligible. So these are just things to keep in mind, you know, and I'm sure that they don't run the whole gamut for translating. And still creating accessible slide decks in translation. Thank you. Next slide, please.
So much, Stephanie. I have to give a presentation in Mexico next week, and it's going to be exactly the very poor Spanish, like from an English accent. So, you know, but here we go. So I'm going to take everybody through a very brief exercise to kind of test your knowledge on accessible PowerPoints. And then we'll get into some time for questions. So we're going to review two different slides. Each one is a hypothetical PowerPoint slide or one that I've drawn from a different presentation and made it worse. So we're going to just go through and if you in the training modules that we're doing, you can take these modules on your own, or you can do it in a group format, such as what we're doing now. So just to show you, if you're doing it in a group format, what I'm going to ask you to do as a moderator is to put your responses in the chat feature. So on the next slide, I'm going to have you look at the slide. And then we're going to have a little response in the chat. And I'll be going back to Stephanie and Michelle to say, like, okay, what are we seeing in the chat that you think is important? So next slide, please. Okay, so here's our first hypothetical PowerPoint slide. I want everyone to take about 30 seconds to look at the slide and then put your thoughts in the chat about what you think needs to be changed. Keep in mind that there may be some things, this one is a little bit tricky because there may be some things that you don't see on the slide that you want to just ask about. Someone's already doing it, so great. All right, I'm going to give everybody about 30 seconds.
So we're seeing a lot of comments about the font consistency and the type, as well as removing symbols, and then the need for alt text under the pictures, and controlling the color choice for individuals with blindness, and making some distinctions between the equality and equity.
Great. So I'm going to go over a couple of these, and then Stephanie, I'm going to ask you to jump in if I missed anything. So a lot of people have pointed out that at least the second one that talks about equality is in a sans serif font, not an appropriate font, and that the fonts are different from each other. So you want to make sure you keep a standardized font. Also, these are center alignment instead of left justified. They also one uses italics, one uses bold, which we've asked you not to use. And they also use symbols around them. So try and refrain from that if possible. Another aspect is that it's not clear which picture refers to which text box. So you don't know if equality refers, which it does, it refers to the one on the left, and equity refers to the one on the left, and equality refers to the one on the right, but it doesn't. Sorry, I messed up. I'm totally, see, this is what happens if you don't put it. So equity should refer to the one on the right because that is showing that everyone is getting the support that they need. Equality refers to the one on the left, and that's showing everyone getting the same support, which is problematic because you can see that the person who uses a wheelchair, clearly the box is not useful for them. So you need to make sure that you're putting your text aligned with the appropriate image. Someone else pointed out, and I love this, there's a couple of hidden things on here. One is that there is no alt text listed for this picture. You would need to insert alt text for this picture and describe what you're seeing on the left and the right. Also hidden is that where it says Accessible PowerPoints Exercise 1, this is actually not the title. This is a text box that has been, you can see it's lower down than a title would normally be. This is a text box that someone inserted, and they didn't put it into the header row. So what happens there is that if you put your slideshow into the outline view, you can usually see what slides have titles, and people who use screen readers can see all of the slide titles and information. If you just inserted a text box that's not in that header format, it's not going to show up in that outline master. And so then you don't know what the title is of the slide that you're working on. Is there anything else, Stephanie, you can think of or that we missed?
Some comments about color choice and color contrast.
Mm-hmm. So the color choice, the color contrast, I did put this through a color contrast checker for the text, and it is appropriate for small and large font because it's a dark blue font. However, we do often have to think about this in terms of the graphic. The graphic in here is it's not blown up to a large enough size where you can see, for example, that there's players on the soccer field. Because they're kind of, you have a little screen bean who's sort of like a black screen bean against the green. So it's a really good point because you have to think about it in terms of your graphics as well. All right, let's go into exercise 2. Next slide, please. Okay, keep going. And keep going. There you go. Okay, so in all of what you just saw, why don't you take about 30 seconds and enter some comments into the chat? Stephanie, would you like to start with some comments that you're seeing?
Yes, a lot of comments about the text being too dense, too much text, and also the size of the text being very small. Some suggestions for bulleting text, and also that we can't really read the graph. We can't read anything on the graph itself. Exhibit 3 has poor color contrast as well. That's a very good point. Blurry. Oh, is this a screenshot? That's a good point. Yeah.
Great. So I see some really great comments. I mean, you've gotten pretty much all of it. The text is it's small. There's a lot of it, and it's not in plain language. So there's just a lot to take in there. You probably want to break this into multiple slides. There's a screenshot that's not only is it blurry, but the information is really small. It's hard to read. So you'd probably want to reformat this. You might want to take just one example, for example, the cognitive piece or something like that, and explain just that piece. The color contrast is poor in the banner that says Exhibit 3. It also zoomed in, you saw it before, and so did the chart. So they went flying in. And then let's see if there's any other ones in here that are.
We have a good question about.
Oh, Stephanie, sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No, please.
We have a question about 6%. Is it better to say 6% or 6 with the special symbol for the percentage?
I don't really know the answer to that question. I think this was formatted this way because I took it from a publication that we published and they wanted us to spell out percent. It may depend on your audience. If you are working with, you're really wanting to put it into a lower grade level, I would say to spell out percent rather than to use the numeric symbol for percent. But you could always also do both if you need to. But I do remember that the publication here had required us to say percent, which drove us crazy because you have a word limit in publications. But really good question. Michelle, anything else before we go on to questions that you see in the chat?
I thought it was excellent that someone wrote that there's no label for the X and Y axis, so it's a little unclear as to what the intent of the graphic is. That was great.
That is a great comment. And I had intentionally removed the axes labels. So very good. So whoever picked up on that has an eagle eye. Okay, well, I'm going to turn it over to Hayat to moderate the discussion. If you have any questions, please, it's a little helpful to put them in the Q&A for questions. We will be monitoring the chat, but if you have specific questions, just type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And then I'm going to turn it over, Hayat, for first set of questions.
Yes, absolutely. So I don't see a question in the Q&A, but I do see one in the chat where people are asking, would using a chart be inaccessible compared to, say, a pie chart? Was there a preference there?
You mean a bar chart like this, I think, if I'm interpreting correctly, versus a pie chart. I think that just in general, when you're presenting on PowerPoints, I mean, it does depend on your audience, but I try to make them as simplified as possible, which often does mean for me a pie chart, which I find a little bit easier to use. But again, it comes back to the description in the alt text for me. That gives me a good guide, the alt text, because for this chart that you see, there's no way I can describe that in 2 to 3 sentences and describe what is being shown there. And I have one of the ones that you'll see in one of the training modules has a pie chart. And it does depend on how complicated the chart is, right? Like, so if it has like 10, 12 slices on the pie chart, some of them are very small slices, very, unique colors. It's difficult to see them and you can't describe it in a few sentences. I would say you still need to think about how you can simplify that a little bit more in your explanation. But Stephanie and Michelle, I'll let you jump in. I'm not, totally sure in terms of which one is better.
I think it depends on your audience. So I think, knowing the level of your audience. So sometimes, the pie charts are a little bit easier because there's not usually so many slices. Depends, like this obviously has a lot of different kinds of answers or options in the percentages. So I think you can put them in buckets and then maybe explain. So like things that are more like physical versus mental and mobility. So like there's different ways to consider the presentation of the information depending upon the audience and if depending upon the content that you're looking or the points that you're looking to get across.
Before we go on, Hayat, to one more question, I just want to say that I forgot a slide. So can we go to the next slide? Okay, so just to let you guys know, since I've been referencing these the whole time, that we have this Accessibility 101 training modules, which I believe that Nanny is putting in the chat. So there's 6 of them. One is an introduction about disability data. It has advocacy points in there that you can use with your own organizations. Another one on mapping the participant journey, which is mainly about physical disabilities, but is showing all different kinds of sites, whether they're fixed or mobile sites. And it gives you pictures of these sites and you have to figure out what the challenges are. Alt text, color contrast, plain language, and then more on PowerPoints. Next slide, please. Okay, so back to questions. Go ahead, Hayat.
Thank you. Okay, I think there is another question about considerations. Are there graphic considerations for color blindness?
I am putting in a Microsoft Office support on that subject into the chat because there are considerations for color and color contrast that take into account different, how to combine colors and what not to combine.
Thank you. So I'm not seeing any questions, but I do have a question for our panelists on, how do we promote a culture of accessibility, when designing PowerPoints within research teams and within institutions? because I think, as mentioned before, it can feel a little bit daunting at first, but how can we make it easier for people to adapt?
Michelle, do you want to start and then I'll jump in, or?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I apologize. I was just typing something into chat. My apologies.
Oh, no worries, and thank you. No, it was just a question about how can we promote a culture of accessibility within institutions, or designing using accessible PowerPoints within institutions where, it might not have been the practice before, and how can we make it easy for people?
Thank you for the question. I think that's a really great question. I think that it's a huge question, and I think the easiest thing to begin is look at the policy leaders in your institution or organization and discuss with them and get them on board. And obviously, some of the things that I mentioned about the community voice or action boards, involvement of individuals with disabilities, because it's not just the policy leaders, because we don't want to make decisions for people without having their voices. So in the inclusion of different individuals within the organization. So it may not just be policy leaders. At Rutgers, we have different policy leaders within the research administration umbrella that I'm part of, but there's also the disability program, disability studies program, and then there's a whole other component of different people that are doing on the ground work with communities of different individuals with disabilities. And as far as the accessibilities and the PowerPoints, we're fortunate, like Stephanie's here and she has the media specialist component. I am not a media specialist component. I was feverishly writing down a lot of the things that Stephanie was talking about and William, because those are great resources. So as you're developing things, maybe working with your communications teams and other people like Stephanie who have that expertise that can really illustrate, the different components that Willianne and Stephanie placed in terms of resources. So I think, policy leaders, inclusion of researchers and academics or other individuals with disabilities and community and involvement, as well as working with those that have the expertise. I think those are great ways to start.
Michelle, those are such great points. And I wanted to add that, when you become an advocate, like a lot of this becomes second nature to you. Like it's, once it can be a lot to start with simple things like, making sure that you're doing alt text or making sure that you're not putting so much information on the screen. Those are kind of easy ways to start. But I'm also kind of shameless about like talking to people about it because, as Michelle said, especially the leadership who give very, if I see, for example, I'm on a group that's involved with leadership and leadership says, we're going to share the slides, for a review that we're presenting to the entire institution. And I'll say, well, these, don't have alt text. They don't have these. Do you want to sit for a few minutes? And, I'm happy to show you how to do it. And most times people will say yes. And it's great because then that goes out to the entire community and you have this group of you're gaining advocates as you go. I have the same thing if I'm presenting at, a big conference or something like that, and they send me a template for the slides, and I'll say, well, actually, most of this is not in an accessible format. You set the font size as 14, by default on the slides. Oh, okay. Like, and then that sets the template format for, everybody else that's working on that. So I think there's definitely ways. First, it's easy, start small, but also be an advocate. And, you have to kind of hold a little bit people's feet to the fire a little bit gently, but, then it comes along. Stephanie, do you have a last word you want to put in? I didn't want to cut you off, but
not at all. No, I agree with you that there needs to be advocacy because the awareness of what we can do to make it the PowerPoints accessible is not always there. So I agree with you.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. I know we have just 1 minute left. If there is one key takeaway that each of our panelists want to leave us with, we would welcome that. And again, thank you for all that have joined us. But are there key takeaways before we end?
Yes, I think that there are key takeaways besides making PowerPoints accessible. Work with individuals that are making the policies. Work with the specialists that develop such phenomenal work in the accessibility arena. And definitely for those of you who are interested in continuing the conversations on advocacy and inclusivity and research, work with folks like Willianne and myself and who want to bring this conversation forward to action, to inclusivity. So serve on an IRB or the community action boards. Definitely reach out to us. We need more of you to keep us, current. So that's my takeaway.
Thank you.
So I would just say, don't be afraid. Like, many disability interventions are low or no cost. Start with what you can do and go from there.
Step by step, just an act, step by step. That's how I did it. Just one piece at a time.
Step by step. Wonderful. Again, thank you so much for our wonderful panelists, and thank you for all joining us today on this webinar. And we will close it, but we will have the recording available and the slides available after a week. Thank you.